And joining us now, Senator Marco Rubio, the Republican from Florida. He's a key member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Intelligence Committee, the Appropriations Committee. Lots of hard work going on up there. Senator, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Wolf. Thanks for having me.
We have lots to discuss. I want to go through some of the news of the day. First, I want to ask you about the news from the presidential campaign that a data analytics company linked to the Trump campaign actually reached out to WikiLeaks trying to get hold of Hillary Clinton's emails. What's your response? Does this surprise you?
Well, it'll be, as I said, the Intelligence Committee that I sit on is continuing its work, hopefully reaching a conclusion here fairly soon, at least something we can begin to share with the American people to give them more clarity. And it's my sense that anything remotely related to something like that would be a part of that endeavor potentially. But beyond it, I mean, I just have chosen not to comment on media reports like that in the midst of the investigation until all the facts are out. What I want is all the facts to be out, no matter where they lead. And then, obviously, people can reach their own conclusions about things. But we got to get the facts out there first.
I just want to be precise. You don't regard this whole Russia investigation as a hoax, do you?
Yeah, I think if people recall back in October when I was running for re-election, I said repeatedly that I was hoping Republicans wouldn't be using any of the stuff that was being put out there because I felt it was the work of a foreign intelligence agency and it was used to undermine our election. And I've told people repeatedly that today it's them, but tomorrow it could be us. So I've always felt this was a serious thing and we're going to look at it. I don't think there's any doubt that Russian intelligence tried to divide us against each other and play an influence in the direction of our elections. On that issue, there's no doubt. On some of the other issues people raised, like collusion and the like, obviously that's what the Mueller's looking at and so forth, and we'll let all those things play out. What I want is very simple. Get to the truth, lay out the facts, and we go from there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let me get a quick reaction to the controversial dossier that's in the news all of a sudden. It has been confirmed the Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee helped fund the research for that dossier. We also know, though, and President Trump himself confirmed this yesterday, that the research was actually started first by an unnamed Republican. The president indicated he knows who that Republican is. Do you know, and I got to ask you the question, was it your campaign? Because you were running for the nomination at the time as well.
Yeah, I don't know who it was. The one thing we do know is that this thing about the dossier that you're discussing, all those press accounts, and I'm just going off press accounts, they all make it abundantly clear that the work that Mr. Steele did on that dossier didn't even start until April or May or June after the Republican primary was over. So that was the DNC and that was the Clinton campaign. And as far as whether it was my campaign, it wasn't, and I'll tell you why, because I was running for president, I was trying to win. If I had anything against Donald Trump that was relevant and credible and politically damaging, I would have used it. I didn't have it.
So your campaign never funded any of the initial research, and you're right, that initial research was done before Christopher Steele, the former British spy, got involved. But just want to be precise, your campaign had nothing to do with it, right?
With GPS, that group, absolutely not.
All right.
I think that I think that's abundantly clear from all the reporting that that it wasn't a campaign-driven thing. But again, we'll see where it all leads.
The Russian sanctions bill that passed the Senate over the summer by a very lopsided 98-2 vote passed the House 419-3. Before the vote, you said you didn't think President Trump would have a problem with new sanctions on Russia, even though he strongly opposed the legislation, only reluctantly signed it into law, knowing he didn't have the votes to override a congressional veto. We're now more than 3 weeks past the October 1st deadline in the law for the White House to act on the sanctions to implement the law. Hasn't happened yet. Do you think the president still has no problem sanctioning Russia?
Well, I said he had no problem because they told me they wouldn't have any problem, and then they did have a problem, but they ultimately signed it anyways. So that's called the executive branch, and the job of the executive branch is to execute, to carry out the law. Congress passed a law. He had a choice to veto it or pass it or sign it. He signed it, and now it's the job to implement it. Now, their argument is they haven't been able to identify all the companies and the firms that need to be sanctioned yet. And I think my response would be, well, sanctions the ones you already know, and then add new ones later as you gather more information. But I think they need to execute the law, and they need to do it. They're already late in doing it. And I don't believe that it is legitimate to argue I'm not going to execute the law because I don't like it.
Well, some of your colleagues are already recommending some steps that the Senate can take if he continues to slow walk implementing the law. What would you do if he doesn't do anything? There's some speculation, as you know, he doesn't want to do anything till at least after he meets with Vladimir Putin in Asia in November.
Well, I think laws need to be followed, and if the law was passed by Congress and signed by the president has an obligation to execute the law. And if there's some reason why he can't that we're not aware of and they want to share, I'll be open-minded about that part. But ultimately, the law should be executed. And if they don't, and that's speculation, I'm not saying they're not going to eventually do it, but if they don't and there's something Congress can do about it, then I would most certainly be supportive of it because I voted for it and I support sanctions.
On the deadly ambush in Niger, what are you being told? Were you aware of the size of the U.S. military footprint in Niger, almost 1,000 U.S. troops there?
Well, I think the families are owed more answers than they've gotten. And as far as what we're being told, not much. I know we'll have some more information later today. I'm not sure it's information that I could share in the press, unfortunately, but I do believe the families deserve answers to what happened and more detail. And so do the American people, by the way, about what happened for two reasons: to bring closure, but also to make sure we're not repeating mistakes that could lead to something like this happening again.
Do you support the Senate passing legislation, a new authorization for the use of military force?
I would, so long as it's properly crafted. I want an authorization for use of force that authorizes us to go after terrorists. And I think if you start limiting it geographically or you start limiting it in terms of the names of the groups change names all the time. We forget ISIS is a spin-off of Al-Qaeda. In essence, it is associated. It was originally Al-Qaeda members that started a new organization. The same is true for geographic limitations. If you get too strict on that, these groups know exactly where they can go and avoid you. So as we see now, that this fight against radicalism has spread to multiple continents, and that we need to have the ability to reach them and degrade them wherever they are.
Senators, your colleagues, Republican Senators Jeff Flake and Bob Corker, as you well know, they've stepped out to seriously question President Trump. The President and the White House have pushed back very strongly with personal attacks on both of those senators. You're calling it a moment of realignment for the party. Where do you stand in this realignment?
I called it a moment of realignment for both political parties and for every institution in society. You got to, the whole statement's got to be taken. And what that means is we're living in a time of incredible changes and realignments: economic realignments, geopolitical realignments, cultural realignments, societal realignment, and everybody. The media is having to reinvent itself. Political parties are having to reinvent themselves to sort of deal with the new realities. And within the Republican Party, there is a debate about what the crux of the party is and what it should stand for. It's a big party with a lot of different views on a lot of different issues. I would argue the same thing's happening in the Democratic Party, where all of the energy right now seems to be in the sort of Bernie Sanders wing of the party, and that's not where Joe Biden or some other people, or certainly Bill Clinton, came from 25 years ago. So this is happening everywhere. It just so happens that when you have a president and majorities, you're going to get more attention on some of the internal debates that are happening.
Let's talk about tax reform while I have you. It's a big issue. The House just followed the Senate lead, passed the budget. Now you guys can go forward. You can make major changes in taxes with only 50 votes in the Senate as opposed to 60 votes. You want, and you're working with Senator Mike Lee, for a major expansion of the child tax credit as part of this overall reform. What if it isn't included? What are you going to do?
Well, let me tell you what happens. If we don't do the child tax credit and we don't make it refundable against payroll taxes, then the middle class and working families in this country will have a tax increase. Not a tax cut, not even break even, they'll have a tax increase. The president is not going to sign a tax increase on working families, and that bill actually wouldn't even pass. So the bottom line is we either put it in and it passes, or it doesn't get in and it won't pass, and or he'll veto it. So that's why I know it's going to happen, and we just got to keep working and make sure it's crafted appropriately.
Will you support any changes in the 401ks, the tax deductions, as far as 401ks, retirement plans, which are very popular, especially with the middle class?
Well, I'm not even sure that's a serious proposal or just something they're floating, staff or somebody's floating just to see what the public reaction to it is. Look, there's a litany of what they call pay-fors or sort of tax treatments within the code that add to about $4 trillion. There's a whole list of them. That's one of probably hundreds and hundreds of items that people are discussing. I'm not sure how that, but I don't think they've settled on anything like that. And ultimately, we're going to see the entire package. And I promise you this, tax reform is not going to have everything I want, okay? It's not going to have everything in that bill that's perfect the way I see it. But in a constitutional republic, you don't get everything you want. And the question becomes, does this make things better or does it make things worse? And if we put together a tax reform package that makes things better for the country, for our economy, for global competitiveness, and for working families, I'm going to vote for it. We must do tax reform. We have no choice for our country, for its future, even for our national security.
Cuba, an important issue right now. They now claim, the Cuban government, that they were they were not involved in those sonic attacks on American diplomats. They say all of those allegations against the Cuban government are science fiction. What do you say to the response? Because what, about a couple dozen American diplomats are suffering right now from perhaps permanent ear damage.
Yeah, it's not science fiction that people are hurt and hurt badly. Now, either the Cuban government did it or they know who did it. I mean, Cuba, Havana in particular, and these places where these attacks are happening are some of the most closely monitored places in the world. The idea that someone could carry out sophisticated attacks against Americans who the Cubans monitor when you go there. If you're an American diplomat or an American working at the embassy and you travel to Cuba, you are being monitored 24/7. You're not just walking around randomly, they're watching you. The idea that someone like that could be attacked in a sophisticated way, upwards of 20 people, and the Cubans not know who did it, is absurd, it's ridiculous. So if they didn't do it, they know who did it. And there's no doubt about that. And anyone who's serious about that issue would know that to be true.
You've, related to Cuba, you've introduced legislation on Cuba and airport security. You write in your legislation that the U.S. government, in your words, needs to ensure robust security measures are in place in order to keep Americans safe. What are the fears? What are the possible threats that you're so concerned about Americans boarding flights in Havana, for example, to fly to Miami or New York?
The same as anywhere else on the planet. You know, when you fly into the United States from a foreign airport, you have to meet, into the United States, you have to meet certain TSA requirements. And we inspect that, we work with those countries to make sure that's the case. That hasn't been the case in Cuba. They're just telling us they do, but there's been no inspection, no follow-up. Why should flights from Cuba be any different than flights from the Bahamas or anywhere else in terms of meeting our security standards? I don't know how you justify that.
Senator Rubio, thanks as usual for joining us.
Thank you.